Good morning. Welcome to our monthly Mornings with O'Keeffe program. My name is Grace Almanza. I am the School and Tour Programs Manager here at the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum. I would like to begin by recognizing the lands of the Pueblo people on which the sites of the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum stand. We recognize and honor their elders, past and present, and celebrate the vitality of their people today and into future generations. I offer this with humility and gratitude in acknowledgement of the need to confront the ongoing injustices of settler colonialism. I would like to extend a thank you to our members and donors who are here today. Your support made this event possible. And if you're not yet a member and enjoy this program, please consider joining today. You can visit gokm.org/membership to learn more. Throughout this talk, you are more than welcome to place your questions in our Q&A box, which can be found at the bottom or top of your Zoom screen, depending on your device. We'll try to answer as many as we can at the end of the conversation. For the duration of this lecture, the chat has been disabled. Please note that following today's talk, a recording will be made available on the O'Keeffe Museum's website in about a week's time. Captions in English are available. It's my pleasure now to introduce our presenters for this morning. One of our presenters first is our very own head of conservation at the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum, Dale Cronkrite. Dale has been head of conservation at the museum since its inception in 1997. Dale began research into O'Keeffe studio materials and techniques in 2000 with scientists and conservators at the National Gallery of Art, resulting in the 2006 exhibition and catalog Color and Conservation, which documented the 40-year friendship of conservator Caroline Keck and Georgia O'Keeffe. Dale earned his BA in American Culture Studies from the University of California at Davis and his postgraduate certificate in conservation at the Peabody Museum at Harvard. Prior to coming to work for the O'Keeffe Museum, Dale was senior conservator for the Museum of New Mexico in Santa Fe for 7 years and was senior conservator at the Regional Conservation Center Bishop Museum, Honolulu for 6 years. Our second presenter today is Anita Feldman, Deputy Director for Curatorial Affairs at the San Diego Museum of Art. Anita is a Deputy Director. She joined the museum in 2014, and prior to that was curator, head of collections and exhibitions, and a member of the Moore Authentication Committee for the Henry Moore Foundation for 18 years, curating exhibitions of his work worldwide and overseeing major conservation initiatives for Moore's works, including for the House of Parliament and Kensington Gardens. So without further ado, I will hand over our lecture to our presenters, Dale and Anita. Thank you.
Thank you.
And welcome, everybody. It's great to have you here. It's great to have Anita here. Anita's connected from her home in San Diego. I'm here in Santa Fe. Anita, thank you so much, first of all, for the exhibition and pairing these two incredible artists together perhaps for the first time, right? I mean, nobody's ever thought about pairing their works and pairing their concepts together for the first time. In the catalog, you talked about both artists having a determined attention to natural forms as an underpinning for their creative process. Can you say just a few words about how that idea came to you?
Yeah, I mean, Henry Moore has been a part of my life for a long time. I was 18 years at the Moore Foundation. And then I came to a conference at the O'Keeffe Museum where I was taken into her studios, and I kept seeing all these things and thinking, oh, Henry Moore would love that seashell, or that, that stone, or, that coiled shape of the piece of driftwood. And, they were just the same things that he collected. And so these connections started to be made about, what the artists actually had in common and how they used natural forms in their work. And I discussed this with the director of the museum and also at the Moore Foundation. And, we took turns visiting each other's sites and getting together and then discussing artists also interacted with surrealism and, their lives in general and, the ideas for the exhibition.
Yeah. And interestingly, like one of the things that fascinated me when you first started working on the exhibition with us was the fact that, both of them were teachers, art teachers in the beginning. Both of them went through the experiences in their homes with World War I and World War II. Both were exposed to non-Western art as part of their initial training and their consideration of what art can do. And they both had exhibitions at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, right? Was that 1946,
Yeah.
I think?
1946. I mean, I think that was such a key thing when you that year in particular, out of the trauma of the Second World War, and what did it mean to have a solo exhibition at MoMA, and what did it mean for MoMA, this formidable institution, to all of a sudden be devoting its program to the artists, not to one after the other, and I think it says something about how their look at nature, that life-affirming quality, that you could find these healing properties in nature, and that it was a way forward for modernism that was quite different from, what other artists were projecting at the time. So one of the things that, I just wanted to look at is, how important to modernism was this look at nature, because we often skirt around that. Trajectory of modernism is always, abstract expressionism, conceptual art, minimalism, all these sort of movements that have very little to do with nature. And yet here you have these two iconic artists where nature is their primary focus.
Yeah, I absolutely agree that there's a moment here where certainly O'Keeffe and perhaps the world turns to nature and natural forms and the things that persist for millennia as a source of solace and meaning. And of course, these two artists continue to use that as a source for the rest of their lives. Let's jump into the slides right now, because your discussion about two iconic artists is really a great point of departure. Let me just turn on the slideshow. Because what really interests me here to start with is, here are the two studios and how important the two studios were to your original concept. For O'Keeffe here, just to take a quick look, this is obviously a photo of her in her Abiquiu studio, but there's bones and horns and stones on the windowsill. There's a small tray of shells and stones here, a box of stones. Specific stones are holding down sketches and works of art. So those natural materials are in the studio sort of all the time.
Yeah.
And then let's have a look at more in his studio. Maybe you can
So
say
his was much more jumbled, you can tell, a little more chaotic in the studio, but they still collected the same types of objects, and they surrounded them not just in their studios, but also in their homes, their gardens. And both of their studios look onto these very open, vast landscapes. So Morris Maquette studio was had a view to the sheep fields in his property, and of course O'Keeffe had this whole look of New Mexico. For the exhibition, we recreated Ghost Ranch and Morris studio, and it's a really interesting comparison, I think, to see the kinds of things that they collected together.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Such great photographs, both of those. And sort of speaking of photographs, I wanted to delve in a little bit, if we could, into the influence of photography, the artist's use of photography, and also how often they were photographed themselves. I've selected just this beautiful pencil sketch that O'Keeffe made of in the 1940s of a sort of deteriorated cottonwood in New Mexico. And you were the first one, Anita, to select this particular drawing for an exhibition. I was thrilled because I think it's one of the most beautiful drawings that
They've never
she's
been
ever
selected
done.
before. It is so gorgeous. And it's so much like Henry Moore's drawings. It's very, very sculptural and also very anthropomorphic. You
Yeah.
can imagine it being like a figure with an arm sticking out.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And her
yeah.
control, her almost photographic control of value, of light to dark, of just penciling in medium shadows, dark shadows, just the handling that is just incredible. But and then as well, the sort of the effect of cropping, it's almost like she's got a camera there and she's cropping out the unnecessary parts of the composition and really focusing in on one part of this stump and its edges and its curves and its serpentine lines. And then, of course, they were being photographed all the time, both of them.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of telling. So on the left, you have a photograph of Henry Moore, out in this very rural English countryside. And then Todd Webb's photograph of Georgia O'Keeffe, in this beautiful landscape that, they went traveling. Both artists surrounded themselves with photographers, and they were very photographic techniques, and also the power of photography to create an image. An image of it's not just of an object. So they were very conscious that they were their own kind of mythologies, if you will. Both artists came to represent not just a kind of international modernism, but also a very national modernism. O'Keeffe was synonymous with American art, and Henry Moore with English.
Yeah,
I love all the rocks because they look so, and of course they both rocks and.
The photograph of O'Keeffe by Webb, they were very close friends, but he's really just sort of understood her whole approach to composition, I think, because to catch her reflection in the water, and then that wedge of light in the foreground that cuts through, this cavern, and it's a remarkable moment. O'Keeffe is literally rafting down the Colorado River in Glen Canyon before Glen Canyon Dam is completed and fills Glen Canyon up. And it's a creative expedition with Todd Webb and Elliott Porter and O'Keeffe going into these beautiful settings. This is obviously one of my favorite pelvis paintings by O'Keeffe, 1944, because she's capturing the moon through a pelvis form. Of course, we'd never know it looking at it, and unless we sort of knew the story about her fascination with holding pelvis bones up to the sky. But again, very photographic effect, sort of capturing the changes in value and shadows of that very sculptural form. I mean, this connected me to Moore almost immediately.
Yeah, me too. The fact that Moore also held up against the sky and looked through the openings and saw his world through them, just the same way that O'Keeffe did. I think that's extraordinary. And the way they played with scale, so you can't tell really how big or small something is. I mean, pelvic bone is actually just a few inches wide, but it looks massive here. Yeah. I think it was like a fox pelvis or something.
Yes, correct. Yeah, a fox pelvis.
Yeah. And Moore would make objects as small as the palm of his hand and hold them up to the sky and view them in a similar way and imagine them any size.
Yeah, let's take a look at that. I've got a slide here that perhaps you can talk about.
So this is a good example showing how he created his art and exhibition in Florence at the Forte di Belvedere. So he had this really tiny, just a few inches tall, and on the left, he's photographed it against a postcard of Florence. So you can see what it might look like with Florence behind it, on another scale. And then there is the arch actually in situ, and you can see how large it is and how similar it is to O'Keeffe's paintings, where you have a curve of bone up against the sky.
Oh yeah, absolutely, with those beautiful clouds in the background. Here's another example of this, perhaps you can talk about.
Yeah, so this is interesting. collected some bones just from a stew pot in his kitchen stew. And he's taken plaster molds of them and created a scene and then photographed it at a very sharp along these sight lines that he drew in pencil. And then photographed it against eye. And so you have this idea that it's a vast, and yet it's really just this, only a few inches tall photographic, assemblage of objects.
Amazing. Yeah, brilliant, a brilliant creative idea. And of course, O'Keeffe is doing the same thing. She's learned from Stieglitz, from Paul Strand, how to look through a viewfinder, how to arrange a composition, how to emphasize things with depth of field and so on. So it's interesting. They're both compositionally and creatively using photographic techniques. This is a great one that's in the exhibition. And by the way, everyone, please, if you can see the show at the current exhibition at the Albuquerque Museum in Albuquerque, New Mexico, which is up through the end of December. The second venue is at the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts, and a fourth venue at the Museum of MFA Boston. Anita has done an amazing job of creating pairings of more objects and O'Keeffe paintings and drawings, and vistas within the exhibitions that really just energize this whole concept of these two artists keeping nature in the forefront of their creative process. I just love this one because it's this mix of this juxtaposition of hard and soft, the horseshoe and the feathers in the foreground, and then her sitting it on a reflective surface and creating the illusion of a reflection in the foreground, and yet remaining slightly
It's so
abstract.
beautiful though. It's painted so beautifully. But also it sort of touches on surrealism with this idea that you have a juxtaposition or surprising objects.
Yeah.
And Moore also did that in his sculptures and drawings. And also he did, these sort of transformation drawings where a piece of bone will become something else. And so it's just interesting how they both played with these ideas of surrealism without actually, being full-fledged members of the surrealist movement.
Yeah, here's a
Yeah,
great
so here on
example.
the left we have O'Keeffe's jawbone with fungus, this enormous mushroom behind this jawbone, and then more of a jawbone, transhuman figures.
Yeah. And so it is more actually using the sort of curve.
So similar to the
Yeah, I mean, it is. They're almost the same jawbone, just turned around to sort of a horse jawbone. And then he's sort of pulling out the relationship to the human figure.
Yeah, I think
drawing.
his jawbone was actually based on a pig.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, remember that, he was living out in Hertfordshire for, more than 40 years,
Right.
from 1940 till the rest of his life. And it was agricultural land. So, you have 70 acres of sheep fields, but, you also have little barns that he turned into studios that used to be, pig shelters. And
Yeah, it's obviously not an accident for either one of them that sort of in the midst of the rise of their respective cities of Manhattan and London, and sort of the rise of skyscrapers and the blossoming of the post-war industrial age, that they both decide to sort of isolate themselves in a more natural environment.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Moore was always interested in working in the countryside, and even when he lived in London, he had a cottage in Kent. And worked in the countryside. And then, of course, during the Blitz, he was forced to leave both his London and his Kent cottage and move to Hertfordshire. But it was around the same O'Keeffe, moving to New York.
Yeah.
But going back and forth to New York. So
This is
they weren't
incredible.
completely isolated. I think it's worth
Right.
mentioning that because, both of them were surrounded by people working with them, and also visited by photographers and printers and, gallerists. And they didn't have these kind of isolated lives that, sometimes people imagine that they had.
Right.
They did leave these big art centers of New York and London, but at the same time, they did go back and forth. So, they
Mhm.
weren't completely cut off.
No, absolutely right. This is an amazing pairing. There's so many Henry Moore works that I've never before seen. This is one of my absolute favorites. The sculpture with these wonderful threads creating this tension. And I was struck by this particular pairing in the exhibition because in both installations, they're very close together. And both of them, I think here have this beautiful interplay and tension between a volume, a sort of volumetric form, a mass, and then the use of line.
Yeah, it's one of his most beautiful stringed pieces. He made string pieces for 3 years from 1939, but this is one that he kept in. So he never sold it and very rarely exhibited it. So we're really lucky to have it in the exhibition. And you can see these blue and red strings. And for him, he said it was like, looking through a bird cage, that you could see one form inside another. Looking through the strings and seeing into a void or into another form is, I think, very much what O'Keeffe's painting is also about.
I agree. And one of the fantastic things of seeing these in person and walking around this particular sculpture and the other string pieces is that when the strings overlap and as you hit different angles, as you walk around the piece, which I think is like fundamental to the experience, you do see these beautiful moire patterns that are created by the intersection of light in the strings. And I have always found that O'Keeffe's works are almost the same in the sense that they benefit from the viewer walking around them, getting different angles on them. And the next slide I wanted to really highlight because one of the things people ask me, sort of what makes an O'Keeffe an O'Keeffe? She stops signing her works altogether almost in 1928. And people say, so how do you know an O'Keeffe? And regardless of whether it's her pastel or her oils or even a drawing, what really defines O'Keeffe for me in many ways is how she handles the edges of forms, that the edges are always so intentionally and sharply defined. She takes an angled brush that she trims with a pair of scissors, and she ends the edge of every form where it meets a background or an adjacent form with a raised edge. And she did the same thing in pastel. When she was creating the edge of a form, she would push pastel up against the edge. And it just seemed to me going through the exhibition that Moore's attention to edges as a way to move the viewer's eye across the surface, as a way of defining negative and positive space is very similar.
Yeah, actually, he called them knife edges. When bones, that you have, both artists were looking at the complexity of bone forms, but also, the smoothness and delicacy of bone forms and that sort of contrast. But this hard knife edge really appealed to both of them. And that's interesting. And here you can see like Moore's white marble, also looking to cycladic art, and he had some cycladic art in his own collection. And just that sort of purity of form, the whiteness. Yeah, it's really gorgeous comparison.
It is.
And they both thought of bones not in a kind of death-like way,
Right.
O'Keeffe had a quote that to her, the bones were just as the animals walking around, which I think is really lovely. And they resilience in bones. Been through these 2 world wars and everything. Bones were something that survived, and they are the most resilient part of being human.
Yeah, and on the desert they're extraordinarily persistent. Just walking around New Mexico on hikes just this weekend, I've found bones in the landscape as well, and they just they remind me so much of sort of the incredible complexity of nature and of natural systems and genetics. The way O'Keeffe in this painting isolates allows the bone to pass through the edges of the work and really, creates this beautiful focus on its sculptural forms, its serpentine lines, and its volumes. Just incredible connection there to nature and how complex and incredible it is. Here's an interesting pairing. Tell us about the drawing here.
Yeah, so the
plate.
idea here is that they're both looking inside the skull at the complexity of forms inside the skull. The more on the right is actually an etching that he made of an elephant skull. So an elephant skull is not something you would find in a sheep field. It was actually given to him by Julian Huxley, who was an eminent biologist and also became director of the London Zoo. And he had access to these animal skulls that give to Henry Moore, including a skull in the exhibition. But there's lots of photographs of Moore with the elephant skull in particular. And it informed a lot of his sculptures. He would take close-ups of just the curve of a bone or the way two bone forms came together, and that would become the starting point for a lot of his sculptural ideas. The etchings are really, really beautiful, highlighting the dark and light and this very fine line, going over the surface of the skull. And I just thought it was a really nice comparison with this painting where you've got the mule skull and you're really looking inside at these forms inside the skull as well.
Yeah, I agree. And one of the other things that I really caught my eye when I was walking through the exhibition and looking at these two is that, of course, natural forms are very, very seldom completely symmetrical. Sort of in this case, there's not complete symmetry on the two sides of the elephant's skull. And things are just a little off. There's a suggestion of symmetry. The same thing happens in the horse's skull and even in the landscape, that O'Keeffe suggests that in nature there's a symmetry, there's a left and a right, and yet they're not perfect. They're still slightly non-symmetrical. The Virga cloud, the rain falling from the sky, falls down in these beautiful, almost waterfall-like forms here in New Mexico, particularly in the summer. And yet never.
And it's
never
so
quite,
imaginative, that it's a starting point for this kind of journey of the imagination. With the poinsettias floating around in the sky, and for Moore too, he had wonderful captions for a lot of his elephant skull etchings.
Yep.
Desert sand hills stretching to the horizon.
Yep.
That, yeah.
I love this pairing, Anita, because when I saw O'Keeffe's Jack in the Pulpit series, it really reinforced for me that negative space, that the spaces between the edges of forms, in this case, in O'Keeffe's painting, the sky and the clouds, they have their own, they suggest their own symmetry around this central form. They're almost more vivid than the flower itself. And of course, Moore is using negative space as an incredible creative device.
Both our negative space was just as powerful as the positive space, and that's a really interesting. We're both exploring that. Like internal, external, of like a form within a form, and one. The pulpit is part of a series where you gradually see the flower unfolding and revealing its internal element. And that's so similar to Moore's sculpture, where you have, this revealing this internal element. And he himself compared it to a flower.
Ah, interesting. Incredible. Let's take a moment just to talk about the use of abstraction for both of them. One of the things I've said here is that, what became clear to me in many exhibitions, in particular the MoMA exhibition that occurred earlier this year over the summer, was that O'Keeffe had adopted abstraction as a way to keep from being contained by sort of all the art that came before her. Abstraction became her way of finding her own voice and finding her own forms and sort of breaking away from all the art that came before her. And I think it's not accidental that she continues to use nature as a form, sort of abandoning industrial and urban forms in New York in the 20s and goes back to nature. And I think part of that is O'Keeffe trying not to become claustrophobic by her own art, by not being contained by what she's done before.
Yeah, this is such a beautiful watercolor. And one of the things that really intrigues me about it is that she's darkened the face. So it, in a sense, becomes kind of universal. It's not of anyone in particular. And yet we know it's a portrait. So it's very personal. And then there's also this kind of condensation of form, which is very sculptural. So, you know, the body compressed, and then you have this space between the arm and the body.
Yep.
So it's very much like the kinds of things that Moore was doing as well. You know, his figures also usually identifiable as a particular person, but are more universal.
Great observation. Yeah. This work is just incredible. And there's so many works that I don't commonly see, and that I'm seeing for the first time. This work from the Dallas Museum of Art, definitely one of them that I hadn't seen before. It has sort of all the effects, right? It has the use of negative space as a form, these intertwined volumes, as you mentioned, nearly figurative in the way she's depicting their volume and their curve, and then cropping and selecting the interplay, not taking the whole tree, not taking even all the trees, but using selection, elimination, and emphasis.
Yeah, it's great, isn't it? Because we all walk around with our iPhones now and take photographs of flowers or all kinds of things and make them larger in our phone and, you know, crop them. And so, you know, it's funny how, you know, she was doing this with her, you know, back in the day. And you get this kind of interesting, you know, sort of, well, what is it, you know, questioning, you know,
Right.
but that kind of introspection, you know, really looking at something hard and seeing something, a detail that's just so incredibly beautiful brought, you know, to full front to you, you know.
Yeah, I always sort of look at O'Keeffe's and Moore's and just kind of pay attention to the way my eye moves across the surfaces. And I mean, in this work, inevitably my eye goes to that triangle, that blue V, sort of right to the left, viewer left of the middle, and then my eye starts to dance around the surface. And
Yeah, and a very kind of restrained palette, right? You know, you've got, you know, these subtle tones of blues and grays, and just these like touches of a warmer color to kind of set it off.
Yeah.
And I think when you have that kind of reduction of palette, you really notice the form even more.
Yeah, absolutely. It's such an intuitive device. Let's take a look at this.
So when you talk about the forms going in and out, I mean, this is such a great comparison with Henry Moore, and we have a smaller version of this in the exhibition, not this particular version, because this one is like 20 feet tall.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great piece. You know, when you're thinking about internal, external forms, but this is taken in Hertfordshire at the grounds where Henry Moore lived. And you could see how he enjoyed placing his sculptures out in the sheep fields because they gave a sense of scale. And of course, they rubbed against the sculptures. And as a conservative, you probably are horrified, but it's very much accepted there that, you know, it changes at sheep height.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Let's take a look at another pairing here. I had never seen this sculpture by Henry Moore before. This beautiful sort of echoed porcelain pair, which, you know, just reflects so beautifully O'Keeffe's echoes of the petals, this abstraction of the petals of a rose. And what struck me when I saw both of these, both in this photograph and in person, was that they both seem to have an incredible fundamental respect for the materials, that the materials that they're using in every single one of these, whether it's a porcelain sculpture, a wood sculpture, O'Keeffe using a pastel or a painting or a sculpture, the materials they're using are economical, they're fit for purpose, they reflect the light in an a very intentional way. It was the idea of intention for both of these artists, and their respect for materials is I think really important.
Yeah, these layering white forms, it's just so gorgeous. And the one on the left, the Moonhead sculpture in porcelain, is actually taken in Henry Moore's home, and he had it, positioned by the window, so you have that natural light falling on it from the side, making these shadows. And in the whites, you see reflected the tones of the things that surround it. Just like in O'Keeffe's painting, have these layered white forms of the rose, and the leaves, but you see the greens reflected in the white.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, incredible. Anita, one of the questions I had was that O'Keeffe sort of iterates forms so often. She'll paint, for example, an abstraction of a rose several times, and each time sort of approaching it differently and changing the light or changing the degree of cropping or the focus, the degree of abstraction. Did Moore work in iteration?
Yeah, he did. So he would often, on a very small scale, take his found objects and position them, reposition them, and photograph them, at every sort of different interplay, and make different models based on, his ideas. And then, he worked in series when you think about, the reclining figures or the mother and child. Like that. He did also photograph his work, moving around the object, photographing it, and around, and O'Keeffe did similar things with photography. She would photograph the same subject, but just from a slightly different angle. She'd move like around the courtyard and photograph the door, things like that.
Yeah, let's take a look at that. This is a this is a really enigmatic composition for me, because I know the site. This is the Abiquiu house. It's sort of looking outside the sitting room in towards the central patio. It's this incredible combination of sort of a cubist approach to these rectangles, very organic serpentine lines at the top. And, she does this all the time. She will take something that looks slightly familiar, that's recognizable, sometimes even absolutely representational, and then put them in a composition that just stops you, just absolutely stops you.
Yeah, it becomes completely abstract. It becomes a sort of play of light and dark, and different shapes and forms. And it's so interesting because at the same time it was something so familiar to her. It was, the door in her.
Yeah. Yeah, this is a wonderful moment because it's 1946 and she's just moved completely into the now completed restored Abiquiu home. It's become her permanent home here in New Mexico. And she's just exploring this in an entirely different way. And talking about enigmatic assemblies, tell us about this.
Yeah, so I wanted to share this because actually it's quite an impressive, heavy sculpture. It has a real presence in the exhibition. But it was actually, the idea originated from two tiny pebbles locked together. He liked this idea of these little pebbles locking together, and then he created this, a massive sculpture called Locking Piece. And there's actually a larger version outside the Tate Gallery in London.
Right.
And you wouldn't know looking at it that it originated from these two little pebbles. But it's just great the way the forms it. Then as you walk around the piece, it opens out and you see this hollow area where you can see through the sculpture to the other side. It's very three-dimensional, and it's one of the few sculptures that he actually put on a rotating, so it actually turns. So I'm not encouraging anyone to try that in the exhibition, but
It's just so talking about interlocking pebbles. This was an entirely new painting for me from the MFA Houston. Stacked rocks, painted as if the view is directly above. This composition of just, as you say, two, three pebbles stacked on each other is just phenomenal.
Yeah, so again, you wouldn't necessarily know what it was, but knowing that they are stones stacked on top is really interesting, because they both collected stones and did stack them, and were interested in the way parts, related to each other and connected.
Yeah, exactly right. Such a beautiful thing. Oh, yeah, I just, this etching relates so strongly to O'Keeffe's approach to distilling a natural form down to just something that's just visually absolutely compelling.
Yeah, and this, this curve of bone and, starting point of the imagination, and then you see the landscape. There's Moore's elephant skull looking at the curve of bone. Another one of the series, his etchings of an elephant skull. And this is the one actually that he had captioned, desert sandhills stretching to the horizon, which I think is
Wow, incredible. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's beautiful. This painting is one that I've become more familiar with over the past, say, 10 years from Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art. This dried tobacco leaf and again, a feather in a completely abstracted background where we have no idea where we are, what the setting is. And yet just absolutely compelling lines against the white and the red backgrounds, these beautiful rhythmic serpentine lines, the tension of the two red forms coming down the top. I mean, they're painted incredibly, realistically. I mean, she's a realist in many ways, but she gains the abstraction by this setting.
Yeah, it's a gorgeous comparison. And also of the other, the horseshoe and turkey feather that we saw earlier.
Yeah.
Here she's trying to turkey feather with another object, it's
Yep.
interesting to
Yep.
see the play with ideas.
But as we close here, I just want to return to the idea of for both of these artists, the imperative of natural forms. This is one from your collection, San Diego Museum of Art, and absolutely, fluid depiction of what is otherwise a very rocky, very dry landscape.
Yeah, but doesn't it also look strangely figurative?
Yes.
It's it looks like a reclining figure, like a detail of a reclining figure, maybe under a blanket, the the mountains becoming like drapery.
Absolutely. And O'Keeffe's sort of reference to the figurative elements within nature, I think, is quite intentional, quite deliberate. Ah, gorgeous. This is
a star in the show. It's over life size, and it's carved from elm wood, from a single piece of elm wood. And you can see how his carving follows the grain of the wood. And it becomes like in itself, with this overarching cliff and the tunnels and the recesses, little pools of light and shadow. And as you walk around it, you feel like you're exploring a kind of landscape.
well, and I also felt it's enormous, and I just felt like I was also exploring this wood, this farmer tree, this absolutely natural material, just incredible. And natural materials again here, O'Keeffe using the backbone of a cow and two small desert primrose flowers, the deer antler, and then Petronel in the background.
Yeah,
and
so
O'Keeffe,
also,
yeah, go ahead.
no, just this kind of feeling of exuberance with the bone,
Mm.
like they're celebrating life. The bone flying through the sky, and with Moore, he's taken a bone and he's just made a figure out of it by adding a head. And it just feels almost like, an ancient sculpture sort of celebrating life.
Absolutely. Agree. And these two, I mean, another painting that I had not seen from the Baltimore Museum of Art, this beautiful waterfall from 1952, almost interlocking separated interlocking shapes, interlocking wedges and V's. And we sort of understand it's a waterfall, but it's so much more than that.
You talked space, and when you look at the water and the waterfall here, becomes like a void with these two forms either side, just like in Moorish sculpture where you have the two pieces in the reclining figures, and the space in between becomes very, very important.
Yeah.
And help you read it as a landscape. I think the painting looks almost like a detail of a sculpture. You've got these sculptural forms coming close together but not touching, so there's that real tension.
Yeah, exactly right. I agree. Great, a great compositional device. And I love this. One of my favorite later paintings by O'Keeffe. This using an actual piece of driftwood, as it were, a stick from a stream in New Mexico, and using it almost as negative space in this case, and surrounding it with a very abstract composition of color.
Yeah, and in this little sculpture on the left, Moore has taken, pieces of shell and also flintstones, and he's just assembled them together and then cast them. These elements relate to other sculptures as well. So, so it's kind of interesting. And the lacquered patina here gives it a real warmth. And then you see like the gaps between everything and the hollows. And I love the way O'Keeffe's painting also divides the composition into these sections where the river becomes a way of dividing the composition.
Yeah, no, exactly right. Just before we turn this back over to Grace to find out what questions people have about this, it strikes me that O'Keeffe always wants you to sort of consider the unique within the commonplace, the things you see every day, getting you to look again, take time to look, as she said. She wants to reintroduce the viewer to new perceptions of the familiar, flowers and trees and so on. But I think she really hopes to shift them just enough to create a perceptual conundrum, to sort of stop you from assuming you know what it is and to really take the time to look. And for me, as I've said here, it's this conceptual stumble that occurs when one experiences a painting by O'Keeffe or a drawing by O'Keeffe that I think is the actual art moment. The object that she's making, she knows, is the device that she can invent to get you to stop and look closely. Do you think Moore is conscious of this process and doing the same thing?
I do, but I also think there's a big difference between Moore and O'Keeffe in that O'Keeffe didn't so much like accidents, whereas Moore embraced accident. So that O'Keeffe painted, she was, very controlled, and she didn't allow for any accidents on her paintings. One of the most intriguing things that I learned actually from you, Dale, was that she didn't mix her paint on the canvas. Right. And I thought, no, how can that be? You look at her paintings and you see this, a gradual change of color. And it's like, well, that has to be mixed on the canvas. And you showed me right. through ultraviolet light that, you could see all the layers and that they weren't mixed on the canvas. And that I found so interesting because, more opposite. He, with his sketch, an offset, on another page, he would use that to start something else. Or if he dropped something in his studio, he fragments and used them for something else. So he was very open to kind of letting things happen.
Oh, fantastic. What a great observation. Yeah, she was definitely, very intentional from the start of the composition of every work. And she would follow an idea, her initial idea, right to the end. And if she looked at it and decided that the composition didn't communicate exactly what she was looking for, right, she would do it again. She would do another one. Great. I'm going to stop sharing now, and we'll go to Grace and see if we can take some questions.
for that wonderful and very interesting presentation, especially for those of us that were unaware of the connection between O'Keeffe and Henry Moore. So very, very great. We had a couple questions come in as y'all were discussing. The most popular, I'm going to highlight one from Judy, but the most popular question was, did the two of them ever meet or have any kind of collaborative relationship, or were they strangers to each other?
Yeah, they were mostly strangers. They did meet once. We have evidence that they met on the occasion of the opening of Moore's exhibition at MoMA in 1946. But apart from that, they did not correspond, and they did have some mutual friends, though, which I think is interesting. Like they both were close to Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera and stayed at their house in Mexico when they visited. And they both were friends of Alexander Calder. So they had some mutual friends, did not have a correspondence.
Thank you. Our second question comes from C.S. Merrill, and they ask, in Montreal, will you hang the show like in Albuquerque or like you did in San Diego? How do you decide how to hang the show in such a sensitive way?
That's a really good question. So one of the things about touring that's so exciting is that every venue is so different. The show does actually look quite different in different spaces. The size of the space is a little different. In San Diego, we had quite a large space dedicated exhibition, and it was more like a passage going from one section to the next, spread out a lot more. Whereas in Albuquerque, it's there, like it's not as it's a little bit smaller space, but they also opened the show with the section that I had at the end, looking at the landscapes. They have landscapes first, so change with the curators and with the space. In Montreal, they have a section of very large, long spaces. So it's going to be different again. And they have to come up with ways of dividing the spaces. And so they're actually taking forms, sculptures, and making to like wall divisions, which is going to be really exciting. You can walk through the chasm to, get to another side of the exhibition. It'll look quite different, but they'll have everything that we had in San Diego and Albuquerque.
Anita, one of the questions that I see up on the screen is the question about how Henry Moore attached the strings in the threaded works, which I found absolutely phenomenal.
Yeah, that's quite complicated. But and I'm not an expert in how they are struck, but I do know the person, who's the conservator at the Henry Moore Foundation. He's restrung a lot of Moore's sculptures. We have experience actually with a small Henry Moore sculpture that I brought to them to be restrung. And the Henry Moore Foundation had the original strings from the 1930s that Moore had colored, and they restrung using the original strings, and it was pretty amazing. But yeah, they're like threaded through, they're hollow. So but the piece that we saw, the bird basket that we saw in the presentation, that's a wood carving. So it's done a little differently. Yeah,
it is. It's incredible. I mean, the holes for the threads, the way he secures the initial thread with a knot within a space. The holes, for the threading are so small and so beautifully, almost organically done. It's like the tree grew this way. How did he find this? But the threaded works are just phenomenal.
They're really great. And he talks about his inspiration for those coming from mathematical models that he saw at the Science Museum. And then you think, yeah, but he's living next door to Nam Gabo and in Hampstead. All the artists that had come over during the 1930s, fleeing fascism in Europe, they were, settling in this small enclave of Hampstead in London.
Yeah,
And
Ryan,
so
Ryan
he knew Gabo, he saw his sculptures, and there's, really no doubt in my mind that that was a big influence.
There's a great question here from Ryan who asks, did Moore ever do paintings we could compare to O'Keeffe's paintings?
Oh, it's funny, hardly any. He did a couple when he was, quite young. But I mean, he did his watercolors. If you think of those as paintings, then yes, but he didn't really work on canvas.
Yeah. And there's a question here about the catalog, which is phenomenal. I mean, the pairings that you create in the gallery are echoed in the catalog so beautifully. But the question is there one catalog for the exhibition, or are the venues creating separate catalogs?
There's one catalog, but in Montreal, they're doing a French edition, but it'll be the same catalog, just in French.
Fantastic. Let's see, I'm trying to think. I mean, there's just tons of compliments, Anita, which I think are very apt. It's just an amazing pairing. It's a creative moment in art history that really deserves so much more attention. Do you have any sense, one question here is, do you have any sense prior to or after 46, when they both have sequential exhibitions at MoMA? O'Keeffe's, I think, is in August. Moore's is in the fall, winter of that same year. Does Moore pay attention to O'Keeffe's work? I know O'Keeffe bought the catalog from Moore's exhibition at MoMA and kept it in her library, obviously, so that she could refer to it. Does Moore, is there any evidence that he keeps track of O'Keeffe's work after that?
I looked into that when I was researching the show, and I found Moore's catalog in the O'Keeffe library, which was great to see. But Georgia O'Keeffe had been promised a catalog, and they didn't make one for her show.
Right.
So and I kept trying to find it, thinking that there was one, because there were all these references to a catalog. And then I discovered that, it never actually happened.
Right.
I think he would have had it if if they'd actually made one. And sadly, it goes down to gender. I'm just guessing that, they gave more importance because he was a male artist, which I think is totally unfair, but that is the way it was then, really. I mean, O'Keeffe would have seen some of Moore's works. Also, he had pieces in the Dada Surrealism exhibition at MoMA in 36. So no doubt she would have seen his work there. Moore did have an O'Keeffe book, but for years in his library. So I don't know how much influence that had. He would have definitely known her work, but he had.
Sorry, Anita, I think I've lost you just for a second. You might have to repeat that when you're back on. Well, we wait for Anita to get reconnected here with, there you are. We lost you momentarily. I'm sorry,
Okay.
We lost your audio. So could you finish that last thought?
Well, just, we don't know for sure how much he actually saw her work, but he would have known of it for sure.
Right. It would have been difficult because while Moore certainly had many pieces installed here in the States, O'Keeffe, of course, did not have exhibitions in Europe. And so it would have been very difficult for him to see her work in England or elsewhere in Europe. One question here that comes up: why did O'Keeffe stop signing her works in 1928? Well, it's interesting. I mean, for a while she doesn't want to interrupt the visual intention of a composition by putting a signature on the front. So she signs in various ways on the verso or on the back of her canvases. And then just stops that in 28, and almost as if she's saying, if you don't know it's an O'Keeffe, you'll never know. And does leave titles and dates and things on the backings that are applied to the frame paintings. But did Moore have feelings about signatures in his drawings and in his etchings? So I didn't see one there.
Yeah, it's funny because it's kind of the opposite with Moore, where really start signing his works until like 1960, the sculptures. So
Interesting.
the earlier sculptures, like the string pieces, they are not signed unless they were cast later, and then sometimes, you know, they're stamped. But yeah, he did, and sometimes he would. It's a little confusing. He would take sketchbooks apart and sell pages, his drawings, and then people would buy them. And of course, those were not signed, but he would see the people later and they'd ask him to sign them. And so sometimes they were signed much later.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, everybody, before we close here, I'm going to turn it back over to Grace for a close, but I just want to remind everybody that the show in Albuquerque at the Albuquerque Museum is open through December 31st. So if you're in New Mexico, please take an opportunity to see these pairings and just see this enormous show. It's a huge number of works. Then in Montreal, it runs from February the 10th of 2024, February 10th through June 2nd. And then the MFA Boston will open October of 2024, so the fall of 2024, and goes to almost the end of January in 2025. Thanks, Grace.
Reminder, this presentation will be recorded and available online in about a week's time on our website and on our YouTube channel. Thank you, Dale, and thank you, Anita, for the wonderful lecture today. And I hope you have a great rest of your day. Have a great one.
Thank you.